Oh, it's time for the mystery document? The rules here are simple. I guess the author of the mystery document, I either get it right, or I get shocked with the shock pen. All right, what do we got here today? I got a feeling it's gonna be a sad one. It was a beautiful fall day with a crisp blue sky. I was coming into work late that day. I guess I didn't have first period class. It was only the second or third day of school. When I emerged from the subway, Union Square was strangely quiet, which only added to the beauty of the day. People were standing still, which is weird in New York under any circumstances, and looking down University Place toward Lower Manhattan. Before I even looked, I asked a passerby what had happened. She, or he, I really don't remember, said that a plane had crashed into the Trade Center. Then I looked and saw the smoke billowing out of the South Tower. I thought it was an accident, but I knew this was not going to be an easy day. Well, it's obviously someone who was in New York City on September 11th, 2001, but that only narrows it down to like 10 million people. However, I happen to know that it is Crash Course historian and my high school history teacher, Raoul Meyer, who wrote that account. This is the saddest I have ever been to not be shocked. So whether George Bush's domestic policy would have worked is up for debate, but the events of September 11th, 2001 ensured that foreign policy would dominate any discussion of the opening decade of the 21st century. That morning, terrorists affiliated with Al-Qaeda hijacked 4 airliners. 2 planes were flown into Manhattan's World Trade Center, a third was crashed into the Pentagon in Washington, and a fourth, also headed for Washington, D.C., crashed in Pennsylvania when passengers overpowered the hijackers. Almost 3,000 people died, including almost 400 policemen and firefighters. As Americans rushed to help in the search for survivors and to rebuild a devastated city, a shared sense of trauma and a desire to show resolve really did bring the country together. President Bush's popularity soared in the wake of the attacks, and in a speech on September 20th, the president told Americans watching on television that the terrorists had targeted America, quote, because we love freedom and they hate freedom. This is another critical moment in American history where the definition of freedom is being reimagined. And we were reminded in the wake of September 11th that one of the central things a government does to keep us free is to keep us safe. But at the same time, ensuring our safety sometimes means impinging upon our freedoms. And the question of how to keep America safe while also preserving our civil liberties is one of the central questions of the 21st century. At any rate, in that September 20th speech, the president announced a new guiding principle in foreign policy that became known as the Bush Doctrine. America would go to war with terrorism, making no distinction between the terrorists and the nations that harbored them. Bush laid out the terms for the world that night: either you are with us, or you are with the terrorists. But that dichotomy, of course, would prove to be a bit of an oversimplification. So on October 7th, the United States launched its first airstrikes on Afghanistan, which at the time was ruled by a group of Islamic fundamentalists called the Taliban, who were protecting Osama bin Laden, al-Qaeda's leader. This was followed by American ground troops supporting the anti-Taliban Northern Alliance in chasing out the Taliban and setting up a new Afghan government that was friendly to the United States. This new government undid many of the worst Taliban policies, for instance, allowing women and girls to go to school and even to serve in the parliament. More women than girls in the parliament, naturally. But by 2007, the Taliban was beginning to make a comeback, and although fewer than 100 Americans died in the initial phase of the war, a sizable force remained, and in the ensuing 12 years, the number of Americans killed would continue to rise. And then, by January 2002, Bush had expanded the scope of the global war on terror by proclaiming that Iran, Iraq, and North Korea were a, quote, axis of evil that harbored terrorists, even though none of those nations had direct ties to the September 11th attacks. The ultimate goal of the Bush Doctrine was to make the world safe for freedom and also to spread it, and freedom was defined as consisting of political democracy, free expression, religious toleration, free trade, and free markets. These freedoms, Bush said, were right and true for every person in every society. And there's no question that the Saddam Hussein-led Iraq of 2003 was not, by any of those definitions, free. But the 2003 invasion of Iraq by the United States was predicated on 2 ideas. First, that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, chemical and biological weapons that they were refusing to give up, and second, that there was, or at least may have been, a link between Saddam Hussein's Iraq and the al-Qaeda attacks of 9/11. So in March 2003, the United States, Britain, and a coalition of other countries invaded Iraq. Within a month, Baghdad was captured, Saddam Hussein was ousted, Iraq created a new government that was more democratic than Saddam's dictatorship, and then descended into sectarian chaos. After Baghdad fell, President Bush declared the end of major combat combat operations in Iraq, but troops soon found themselves trying to manage an increasingly organized insurgency that featured attacks and bombings. And by 2006, American intelligence analysts concluded that Iraq had become a haven for Islamist terrorists, which it hadn't been before the invasion. In fact, Saddam Hussein's socialist government, while it occasionally called upon religion to unify people against an enemy, was pretty secular. Although fewer than 200 Americans had died in the initial assaults, by the end of 2006, more than 3,000 American soldiers had been killed and another 20,000 wounded. Hundreds of thousands of Iraqis had died in the conflict, and the costs of the war, which were promised to be no more than $60 billion, had ballooned to $200 billion. So that, and we try very hard here at Crash Course to be objective, was a bit of a disaster. But let's now go back to the domestic side of things and jump back in time to the passage of the USA Patriot Act, which, believe it or not, is an acronym for the Uniting and Strengthening America by Providing Appropriate Tools Required to Intercept and Obstruct Terrorism Act of 2001. Oh, Congress, you don't pass many laws these days, but when you do, there's some winners. The Patriot Act gave the government unprecedented law enforcement powers to combat domestic terrorism, including the ability to wiretap and spy on Americans. At least 5,000 people connected to the Middle East were called in for questioning, and more than 1,200 were arrested, many held for months without any charge. The administration also set up a camp for accused terrorists in Guantanamo Bay in Cuba, but not the fun kind of camp, the prison kind. It housed more than 700 suspects. The president also authorized the National Security Agency to listen into telephone conversations without first obtaining a warrant, the so-called warrantless wiretapping. In 2013, Americans learned that NSA surveillance has of course gone much further than this, with surveillance programs like PRISM, which sounds like it's out of an Orwell novel. I mean, both like the name and the actual thing that it refers to. Meredith would like us to point out that PRISM is also the name of a Katy Perry album, proving that we here at Crash Course are young and hip and with it. Who is Katy Perry? Oh, right, she has that song in Madagascar 3. Sorry, I have little kids. The Supreme Court eventually limited the executive branch's power and ruled that enemy combatants do have some procedural rights. Congress also banned the use of torture in a 2005 defense appropriations bill sponsored by Republican John McCain, who himself had been a victim of torture in Vietnam. But the Defense Department did condone the continued use of so-called enhanced interrogation techniques like waterboarding, which most countries do consider torture. But George W. Bush won re-election in 2004, defeating the surprisingly weak John Kerry, who was characterized as a waffler on a number of issues, including the Iraq War. Kerry's history as a Vietnam protester and also terrible windsurfer probably didn't help him much. Bush's victory is still a bit surprising to historians. Admittedly, at that moment, the Iraq War seemed to be going pretty well. But during Bush's first term, the economy, which is usually what really drives voters, wasn't that great at all.